isn't that much difference in the far left and the far right. It means secret police and executions and poverty and state control.
How did you get involved with the IEA?
About 11, 12 years ago, no more than that probably, I knew Mark Littlewood, who's the Director General of the IEA. I'd seen him around at various events in London. At that time I was kind of just working as a freelance journalist, I guess, an author. I'd written 3 books, one of which was about the anti-smoking movement, history of the anti-smoking movement, and another was a book about a book called The Spirit Level, which was quite popular briefly around 2009, and I wrote a kind of rebuttal to it. Both of those issues were quite interesting to the IEA, and I started doing a little bit of work for them. I've been doing a little bit of work for the Adam Smith Institute, another think tank, and then they took me on full-time in 2013. Basically, the idea was my whole thing, which I've been blogging and writing about for a long time, was what you might call the nanny state, anti-smoking, anti-drinking, anti-gambling, all this kind of stuff. And free market think tanks were responding to some of this stuff already, but Mark thought there was a gap in the think tank market for somebody who would look at these things more comprehensively and do more research around it and look at the arguments before and against a lot of the policy proposals that were coming out at the time and continue to come out now, things like plain packaging for tobacco, minimum pricing for alcohol, the clamp down on fixed odds betting terminals at the time. This stuff's always in the news, and rather than just have somebody respond to it and say, this is a nanny state gone mad, let's have somebody whose full-time job it is to really understand the data and the studies and the economics of it, because the economics of it tend to get overlooked.
And do you enjoy researching it?
Yeah, I love it. Like I say, I was doing it before anyway, really. And when I was writing the book about the anti-smoking movement, which is really mainly a history, it got me interested in looking at some of the science, not about the science of smoking and health, but the claims around what Policy X would do, or indeed what Policy X has done, the costs and benefits, the trade-offs involved, and a lot of this stuff is quite low quality, advocacy-based, policy-based evidence. And so I found that quite fun, actually, really, as much as anything, just to see how degraded public health science had become. So I was already, writing about it, blogging about it. I was doing a bit of media about it when I was asked here and there. So now, since 2013, I've been doing effectively my hobby as my job.
Great. The dream.
Yeah, it's not bad. I like it.
Okay, so can we go back to the start and talk about how you grew up?
How I grew up? Well, I grew up in North Yorkshire in a very small village. I mean, I live technically in a village now on the south coast, but there's about 20,000 people there. Where I grew up, there was less than 20 people there. Place with
so it's like a
hamlet. Funny hamlet, you might call it. Exactly, yeah. It's basically 2 farms and 1 or 2 houses for whoever ended up there, a few farm labourers, a few retired people, and that was really it. It's a weird place to have a village. I mean, I think it's been there for probably about 1,000 years, but there's no river going through it. It's got no church, it's got no pub, it's got no shops, it hasn't got anything. It's just a bunch of houses and 2 farms. And you don't have to walk very far. A mile away is another village, which is a bit bigger, which does have a shop and a pub, or did have a shop. So you're not completely in the middle of nowhere, and you're right next to the A1. So, there is life. But, those kind of places, you basically need to have a car. And they're very good once you have a car at the age of 17. And they're very good when you're a young kid, because you can go around and, my dad's a farmer, my granddad was a farmer. So we had a small farm of 100 acres. And it's great when you're a kid, because you can make dens and go off and do what you like in the summer holidays and so on. But then as you get a bit older, it gets a bit more boring, because you in order to see anybody of your own age, basically you need to be given a lift 5 miles into the nearest town, and that wasn't always a possibility. There's not really a taxi service or anything like that. There's a bus service that goes like literally once a day in and out of Ripon, which is where I went to school. And so, yeah, well, then things change when you get to 17 because you can get a car then. And so everybody in that neck of the woods passes their driving test within months of their 17th birthday. The problem then, of course, is you can't drink. And so then you have to have a system of designated drivers and people giving them lifts all around the place. Unless you're going to drink drive, which we didn't really do. I think earlier generations had been a bit more laid back about drink driving. But by the time you got to their 90s, it was taken a bit more seriously. So you drive a lot. I hardly drive at all now, living down where I am, and it's quite a nice freedom to be able to walk out your house and go to a shop, a pub, whatever, which people in towns and cities obviously take for granted. But out there, you're driving everywhere all the time, and gets to be a bit of a drag. A lot of people like it. There is a certain amount of freedom in being able to drive around, and the traffic's not like in London, so it's okay driving. But yeah, so I grew up there on a farm, and
what kind of farm?
We're a bit of both: arable, sheep, cows. It changes really. At the moment, it's primarily sheep with some bulls and corn. We've always grown barley or wheat. In the old days we grew potatoes, but that became a bit too much like hard work really, kind of riddling potatoes. These days a lot of farmers just like to get the stuff planted and then combine it, or just pay somebody to combine it. It's all a lot of contractors now on the job. So yeah, farming wasn't for me. My brother's taken that on, and it's a nice life in many ways. I'm not knocking it at all. But there's not a lot of money in it, particularly at that level. If you're small, 100 acres is nothing. So it's a bit of a difficult existence, but there is a lot of freedom to it.
What kind of freedom?
Well, I mean, you're your own boss. You basically do things pretty much when you want to do them within the laws of nature. There are times of the year you got to get things done, and you're very reliant on the weather. But in terms of when you do them, it's kind of up to you. It's kind of up to you what kind of farming you want to do. In the case of that farm, do you want to go into cattle this year, or do you want to stick with sheep, or do you want to put more land out to pasture, or to grow stubble turnips, or whatever, And there is that sense of freedom of being in the middle of the countryside. You don't feel, unlike being in the middle of London, you don't feel like there are people filming you, every time you leave the house. There's much more of a sense of self-reliance, which is a double-edged sword. But if the tree comes down and blocks a road, you don't ring the council up and get them to come and get it out of the way. You get a tractor and a chain, and you do it yourself, and then maybe you chop up the wood, and that's you sorted for the winter. But yeah, I mean, there's much more self-reliance in the countryside. There has to be. There's also, I think, a more, I'm not going to overdo the community spirit element of it, but there is a sense in which people do depend on one another. Less so as the years have gone on, I guess, but there is more of the sense of community. I mean, you imagine if you're in a very small village, people are bound to know one another. So yeah, I mean, I when I go up now, I live right down on the south coast, and I drive up 3 or 4 times a year for basically for Easter, summer, and Christmas, and you just get this sense of freedom once you get way above London and you start going up the A1 or the M1 past Peterborough, and essentially there's not really much there until you hit the northeast really. And the traffic begins to thin out when you get above Leeds, and you just feel this sense that there is a bit more space, and there is a bit more freedom. It's probably all in your mind, really. It's the same country, obviously, but there are fewer people around, and that's, I think, quite nice.
How come you don't have a strong Yorkshire accent?
I never really have had, but I've lived down here for 16 years. And I used to have a stronger one than I've got now, but I do a lot of media stuff. You need to make yourself understood, and no, I've never really had a very strong Yorkshire accent. My brother's got a stronger one, but he's lived, in Yorkshire all the time, surrounded by farmers. So people's accents change over the years depending on where they are. I know someone who went to Australia backpacking for a year in the 1990s. He's still got a slight Australian accent.
Okay, so where did you develop your free market thinking?
Well, primarily at the IEA, I think. I mean, I'm not one of these people who I didn't study economics at university. I did history. I did economics at A level, but that was the end of that was as far as it went. So I did history at university, and I've always been, I think, a fairly instinctive libertarian. And I've never done that much reading around it. I've never read any Ayn Rand or anything like that. I read John Stuart Mill at university, basically, and that was good enough for me. I distinctly remember in the first year, because I did politics as well, in the first year of politics, there was like a four lecture kind of overview of four major political thinkers, and one of them was Mill, John Stuart Mill. One of them was Karl Marx. I can't remember who the other two were, probably Rousseau or Burke or somebody like that. I can't remember, because the only one I really remember was John Stuart Mill. And the lecturer explained his basic philosophy, which essentially amounts to your right to swing your fist ends at my nose. And this seemed obviously true to me. It didn't seem like I was being given one guy's opinion. It was more like, well, this is how things are, and this guy explained it really well. And I still think that. I don't remember what I made of Marx. I mean, I was quite left-wing at the time.
In what way?
Well, I wasn't opposed to reading the Communist Manifesto and stuff like that. And I was a member of the Labour Party briefly in 96, 97, just before that election. I wasn't a big activist, I have to say. I only went to one meeting, I think. But I did I did do the exit poll in Gallgate. I was at Lancaster University, and Gallgate's a little village nearby, and I spent 2 hours outside this polling booth in Gallgate with a big red rosette on my chest, and asked people how they voted, which was overwhelmingly for the Labour Party, or so they told me. I mean, the seat certainly did go from blue to red, so I don't think that many people were lying about it. And I did that as part of the Labour Party's local plan, and there was a guy in Gallgate who was coordinating all these people, and he was making sure there was little minibuses going around to pick up all the Labour voters who wouldn't necessarily get to the polls otherwise, and quite a well-structured organisation. And at the end of these 2 hours, on this blistering, lovely hot day, May the 1st, I guess, 1997, I went back and I gave this guy the sheet of paper with the exit poll, on it, which was just a load of ticks underneath the Labour box, really. And he said, "Thanks very much, son," and he popped a cigar in my top pocket and said, "Smoke that for victory." And then 10 years later, the Labour Party banned smoking, which I found rather ironic and cruel, because I was a big smoker at the time. I'm not anymore, but I was a very keen smoker of cigarettes from the mid-90s onwards. And by that time, I was certainly not a Labour Party member, and I didn't describe myself as in any way left-wing. And a few things that had gone on under Blair had made me gradually switch away from that point of view. But throughout that period, I'd been basically libertarian, even if I didn't identify as such or recognise as such. And one of the things actually I quite liked about Blair is I thought he was a bit more libertarian than the Tories. And people forget now, but he did do quite a few things the Tories probably would have never done. So he did relax the gambling laws in 2003. Well, it came in 2005, I think. But passed it in 2005, came in 2007. So he didn't relax them as much as I wanted, or it didn't relax them as much as he wanted, actually, because Gordon Brown undid some of the lovely plans to have a super casino in Blackpool. But they relaxed the gambling laws. They relaxed the drinking laws a lot. And they let the pubs stay open later. He introduced so-called 24-hour drinking, which doesn't really exist anywhere, but in theory, you can, places can open 24 hours a day. In practice, places open at the weekends till about midnight or 1 o'clock. in most of the country, apart from Westminster. Funnily enough, we've got one of the worst councils in the country. But most sort of market towns, the kind of places I used to go drinking when I was growing up, there's always at least one or two pubs which are open at least till midnight, often till 2 o'clock, which never used to be the case. Before Blair reformed the licensing laws, it was pretty strict, 11 o'clock kick out, and if you wanted to drink after that, you had to go to some awful nightclub where they would be serving burgers and chips as part of their licensing deal to be able to sell alcohol.
So why is that still the case here, that pubs have this last call at 11 p.m?
Mostly because they don't want to stay up later. I mean, they could all apply for a later license, and they should really be able to get one pretty easily, even if the council's not that keen. But the reality of it is that there aren't that many people around after 11 o'clock who want to have a drink.
And was that to do with factories, or is that a load of rubbish? That they closed early to make sure everyone was at work at 9 a.m?
Well, there might have been a bit of pressure from the captains of industry on it. I don't know. The history of licensing laws in this country, I can't remember when they first brought in a kind of compulsory closing time. I mean, for a long time, going way back, I think pubs would have been able to close whenever they want, like they do in most of Europe. The First World War led to the 10 o'clock closing time, and then that was kept in a long time afterwards, and then it went to 10:30. But also there was the afternoon closing, so pubs were always closed between 3 and 6, I think.
Wow.
And then under Margaret Thatcher, she got rid of that.
Why was that a rule? Why was 3 to 6 a rule?
It was to stop people drinking all day, I would assume. I mean, I think that's what it was. And even in the mid-90s, it was still that was still the rule on Sunday. So they'd kick you out at 3 o'clock, and you'd have to go look for something to do for 3 hours before you could go back in again. And they didn't get rid of that until, I don't know, maybe Tony Blair, late 90s. And Thatcher extended it from 10:30 to 11. And I think got rid of the afternoon, restrictions. So it's been a gradual process of relaxing it. But Blair went full-blooded relaxation, and there isn't really anywhere you can go for 24-hour drinking except for a supermarket. I mean, there's a lot of supermarkets are open 24 hours a day, and you can buy alcohol 24 hours a day in some of them. But the reality is, most people don't want to be drinking past midnight in a pub on the weekday, and so it doesn't make any sense for pubs to open that late.
But your view is there should be no rules around it?
No, I mean, the system that they have in most European countries works perfectly well, which is that the guy who owns the bar closes whenever he wants, and that could be 2 o'clock in the afternoon, or it could be 4 o'clock in the morning, but they do it when it's not worth their while opening anymore. So if you've just got 2 people left in there drinking at 2 in the morning, you say, sorry lads, I'm closing now. But it's not the law. And there's no real reason why it should be the law, but we've always been treated like savages in this country, and possibly we've justified that at times. But a system in which you allow the person who runs a pub to decide how long they keep serving alcohol seems pretty normal and civilized to me.
Okay, so going back, why did you join the Labour Party to begin with?
I just wanted the Tories out because I thought the Tories weren't libertarian enough, basically. And they'd also had a long time in power. They were there for 18 years. They'd been in government my entire life, really. I was born in 1976, so I didn't remember anything but the Tories. And there was an element of the grass is always greener about it. And Tony Blair seemed like a pretty reasonable guy. And I was, what was I, 18 or 19 at the time. And I think they did need to go in 1997. I'm not a great fan of the Tories at the best of times, really, but they definitely needed to go by then. They were completely worn out. They were ready for opposition. They didn't really have any ideas. They had turned the country around massively economically. If you look at the state of Britain in 1979 and look at it in 1997, I mean, it was completely chaotic. It was just a horrendous. Other countries felt sorry for us in the late 70s. By 97, it was great. Oh, because of everything.
Was that when it was like the lights couldn't even stay on.
The winter of discontent, all the strikes, inflation. We're obviously seeing a bit of it again now, how high inflation leads to turmoil, and people quite rightly don't want to see their wages go down, so they go on strike in the public sector. But this led to a spiralling of inflation, the wage price spiral. But it wasn't just that. There was also this sense that the whole country was falling apart, and no one knew what to do with it. And the service was terrible, and everything was grey. London was a ghost town, pretty much. London only. This is an amazing fact. London only got back to its population size of 1939 in about 2015.
Where did everyone go?
Well, it was more that the place got bombed so much they rebuilt it, and when they rebuilt it, they built it less dense, right? So it was just squalid beforehand. There was so many people living to a house, living to a room. It then got bombed, and they started making better housing. But also people left, and people left in large numbers, particularly in the 70s, because it just seemed like this whole country is doomed. People look in shock at net migration figures now. It's like 500,000 people came to the country and net last year. But for a very long time, there was net emigration. There were more people leaving than there were coming here. So, there's some people have tried to sugarcoat the past on this, but the 1970s were, by any objective measure, just a pretty rough time to be alive. 3-day week. All this kind of stuff. And by 1997, Britain was a pretty cool country to be in. It was great. It was thriving. The economy was going well. It was vibrant, and it seemed to me that Tony Blair was a guy to continue that and, in fact, improve it. And I would stand by, voting for him not only in 97 but also 2001, because I think he did quite a lot of good things. He went downhill when he invaded Iraq. It was not something I was too keen on. Like I think most people, but also he started getting pecked by his backbenchers, and he started doing various illiberal things that I wasn't too keen on. And he wanted to bring ID cards in. He banned fox hunting, which isn't, it's not something that's dear to my heart, but it didn't seem to me to be any business of the government how foxes were killed. And then the final straw was he banned smoking, and then Gordon Brown
restaurants
came in. Everywhere, yeah. So that I felt a sense of betrayal about that, particularly after the guy popped that cigar in my breast pocket 10 years earlier.
What kind of cigar was it?
I can't remember. I think it would have been anything very impressive. A Hamlet, probably.
So what libertarian things did you care about in your early years?
Well, in my early years, I just felt that things were naturally going to improve anyway. So it's not like I wasn't really worried about it particularly. It felt to me like the natural cycle of civilization was just this gradual march towards a freer society. And I remember thinking at quite a young age, I mean, like when I was about 13 or 14, I remember thinking that there were various silly restrictions on, what could be said on television, for example, or the drug laws, and that as my generation grew up and took over, that stuff would just go, and eventually it was obvious that drugs would be legalized, right? And
really,
yeah, it just felt that was the way things were going, and they were, if they were, this will be like early 90s, and
what kind of drugs were you thinking about back then?
Well, all of them, really. I mean, I wasn't into drugs. I was 13, 14. It wasn't something that was close to my heart. It was just an example of something where, the government clearly shouldn't be telling us what to do in this area.
Where did that come from? Like your parents or...
No, not at all. No, I don't know. I don't know where it came from. But I was looking around at, things that you can't do that doesn't seem to be any of the government's business. And that seemed a fairly obvious example.
What was some of the stuff on TV that you couldn't say?
Well, just general. There wasn't that much of it by then, but over the course of the previous 30 years, there'd been a massive relaxation of censorship. Right in early 1960s, you still had to pass your script through the Lord Chamberlain, right? If you wanted to put something on stage, right? There was a state censor, effectively. That was then got rid of. And then in the mid-60s, people start saying the odd swear word on TV, and it's very shocking, but then people get over it. Then the late 60s, early 70s, a huge deregulation of cinema. And so you suddenly get these like slasher movies and, you know, X-rated pics and stuff like that, and there's not much anyone can do about it. But you still had protests about, you know, the life of Brian or Ken Roach's films, or, you know, this kind of thing. And then in the 80s you had the video nasties and the whole moral panic around all these, you know, cannibal holocaust and movies like that. But it was all being relaxed, is my point. It was all gradually being relaxed, and it seemed to me that we would continue relaxing things because that was just the natural course of progress, and that as people become more civilized, they get less uptight about, you know, the old, I regret, you know, primarily religious-led forms of censorship, Sunday trading laws, you know, things like this still strike me. We haven't really got many of them now, but, you know, they still exist.
This country is crazy that it's only 6 hours on Sunday for a shop over a certain size. Yeah. And Easter is the same. That's like crazy to people who...
But you're Australian, right?
Yeah.
I know. But you can't buy a drink in an off license on a bank holiday, can you, in Australia?
Yeah, you can.
Can you? The bottle shops are open? I remember them being closed when I was there. It was a while ago, but... And you had the pubs... I'm not having a go at Australia, but the pubs were closed at 6 p.m. for decades in Australia.
Oh, yeah. You couldn't drink on a Prime Minister illegally drank on a Sunday one time. But I feel like that was like 100 years ago.
A bit less than that. But but you're right. There's Sunday drinking laws are crazy. It was an example of the kind of thing I just thought would naturally go away.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Australia's a massive nanny state. Mm-hmm. But we don't... It doesn't feel like those really practical, you know, it's like you have to wear a bike helmet, stuff like the most speeding cameras in the world, those type of rules that are like all about safety. Mm-hmm. Whereas here, when you're just like, oh, I want to go to the supermarket at 11 a.m. and on a Sunday, and it's like, no, you've got to wait till 12.
No, it's only 10 o'clock. But yeah, I once got up really early on a Sunday by my standards and thought I'm going to go shopping. So I went to Tesco. It just did not occur to me that I wouldn't be able to actually buy anything at the till until 10 o'clock. And they open at kind of 9:30. I happened to get there about 9:30. I'm walking around and going like, there's not many people there. This is good. So I fill up my trolley and I see all these people queuing at the tills, but there's nobody at the till to serve them. I go, this is weird. And eventually I join them at the till, and then I look at my watch. It's like 5 to 10. And suddenly at 10 o'clock they all get on and start ringing the registers. Yeah, it's weird, right? But I mean, that's just, it's an example. And, you know, there weren't that many examples like that. I'm not trying to claim that, you know, 1990 Britain was, you know, the equivalent of, you know, Victorian England. But there were things that struck me, even as a fairly young lad, that made me think that, you know, this is silly. The government shouldn't be involved in this. So when I say I'm a natural libertarian, that's what I mean. I didn't get this from reading Robert Novich or even John Stuart Mill. I just thought, well, the government has no place telling us what to do with this. And so when Blair started going, actually, it's not up to the landlord whether people smoke in their pub, and it's up to us to stop people chasing foxes around the fields, I was like, no, I'm not having this. And I'm not saying the Tories were any better, particularly. I'm not making a pro-conservative case, because they've made a mess of the country in the last, however long it's been, 12 years as well. I'm just saying that my instinctive politics is old school liberalism, and I didn't like the Tories in the 90s because I thought they were too paternalistic and authoritarian, which they were in many ways, and I assumed that Labour would be better, and for a while I think they were, and then they were worse than the Tories were on it. And to be fair, David Cameron was awful, and even Boris Johnson was awful, and maybe Liz Truss would have been better, but we never got to find out.
Can you explain? I heard you saying this idea on a podcast you did, it was probably a couple of years ago, about that really there should be something like five parties. Because I think people get so confused with this stuff. Even you now being part of the IEA, which people, and I think you're saying this as well, people would think, oh, this is this right-wing thing. Because people think libertarian means like ultra right-wing. When it's like, and this is what I found at Cambridge when I was like, okay, there's not a lot of places where you can have open debate. So I went along to the Conservative Party, And I was like, hang on, these aren't my values at all. Like, these people think I'm like, that capitalism's disgusting and like that they're not about free markets at all.
The Conservatives,
Yeah, they were about like reinstating like a class system, and they thought I was a convict and like was just
Okay.
And they thought finance was disgusting, and making money for yourself was disgusting. Which I'm like,
I mean, firstly, the left-right axis really does not work in explaining the opinions of very large numbers of people, because it doesn't make any sense. And libertarianism is the perfect example to illustrate why it doesn't make any sense. So if the perception is that libertarians are right-wing, then presumably people who are very libertarian are the far right, right? But there already is a far right, and they are extremely authoritarian and about as far from libertarianism as you can possibly get. Now, horseshoe theory would say that really what you have is authoritarianism at one end and libertarianism at the other. And so if you look at libertarianism, let's say on a clock, right? Libertarianism is at 6 p.m. and then you can go to the left and the right on that, and you have more left-wing libertarians and more right-wing libertarians until you get round to 9 o'clock would be pretty, the centre left. 3 o'clock would be the centre right, and then as you keep getting up towards midnight, the parties are more and more similar, because you've got the far left and the far right, and there isn't that much difference in the far left and the far right except for their stated intentions, really. But in actual practice, it means secret police and executions and poverty and state control. So that, as a way of explaining politics, works a lot better for me. Seeing it as a horseshoe or as a circle is much better than seeing it as a straight line, because people like me are completely left out when it's just left versus right. Now, the left-right dichotomy came about after the French Revolution, and the reason it's conservatives are considered to be on the right is because the more royalist, traditionalist people would sit to the right in the French Parliament. I can't remember to the right of what, but to the right of something in the French. And the more radicals would sit on the left. And so that's really what it means is radicals versus conservatives. But of course, the radicals, that covers a lot of ground. So, a libertarian would be a radical, but so would a communist. So again, you're putting these two completely different groups on the same side, which doesn't make any sense. In terms of party politics, I mean, obviously two parties is not enough. I mean, the Conservative Party should split, really, because, and maybe it will. Well, between old school Burkean, pro-monarchy, pro-religion, pro-military conservatives and free market Thatcherite liberals, really, that's the thing. I mean, Thatcher was a liberal. Liz Truss is a liberal in the classic sense of the word, classical liberals. The Liberal Party isn't liberal. The Liberal Party is just another social democratic party. So they're kind of a waste of space, really, because they're just Labour light. Okay. But they, some of them have, a righteous bee in their bonnet about certain civil liberties issues, which people in Labour perhaps don't so much. But that's really the only distinction. What we should have is really a two-party system in which you have Conservatives and Liberals. Classical liberals. There shouldn't be a socialist party at all, because socialism is evil, and any reasonable country should have grown out of this by now. But okay, if we're going to represent people who still have infantile socialist beliefs, you have three parties, but you have a socialist one, a liberal one, and a conservative one, and then you can actually split people up a bit better. But so libertarians, liberals really are men and women without a party in this country, and have tended to lean towards conservatives because now and again someone like Margaret Thatcher essentially infiltrates the Conservative Party or changes the Conservative Party, at least in some way, to make them at least economically liberal, even if they're not necessarily socially liberal.
So I think the other ones you'd said were like a further right party that's like UK, like, ultra-national party.
Well, I don't think there's a need for that either, particularly. But I mean, they would fit in more with a traditional Conservative Party, right? And so the people who, really don't like immigration very much would be part of the right-wing party. There should be a classical liberal party, a left-wing party, and a right-wing party in a genuine traditional sense of right and left, in which you have, well, not traditional going back to the French Revolution, but in the way that's generally understood today, in which left is basically socialists, right is basically conservatives.
But maybe amongst the left, and I think this is kind of maybe how you said this on this podcast, was amongst the left, don't you also need a split where it's like the left, like the workers who are like, we care about unions and blah blah blah, but they don't care about these social issues, and then you have more like a Green Party, which is all about like which is like the young people at universities,
and then also basically a communist type party as well. So the Labour Party is a very broad church too, and it's been taken over the years by what Marxists would probably consider to be bourgeois elements, which it has for a very long time. And to be fair, Blair was very much a part of that. Blair took the Labour Party away from its normal course completely, almost as much as Thatcher had done with the Conservatives. But it suited me because I like economic liberals and social liberals, which Blair was. But yeah, the Labour Party really should split between a sort of SDP type party, which now exists. The SDP is a very small party, but it is the socially conservative, economically left-wing party, which they don't believe that men should be using women's bathrooms, and they do believe there should be an industrial strategy, and they're in favour of trade unions, and they're your old school, sort of northern red wall type Labour voters. No nonsense. Hard working, just want a fair deal, want better pay for themselves and their members and blah blah blah. Okay, it's fine. Old school Labour, not really represented for many years in the Labour Party. Then there can be like you say, a Green Party type, middle class, obsessed with identity politics type party. Massively internationalist, hugely pro immigration, pro EU, pro all this kind of stuff, which has been pretty well represented in the Labour Party over the years by quite a few people. And then a sort of Jeremy Corbyn type, old-fashioned, far left party, essentially. So Corbyn's almost like the SDP, except that unlike the SDP, he's not really socially conservative. He's socially quite radical, and he is in bed with the kind of stuff that gets taught by left-wing academics these days.
What kind of stuff is that?
Well, critical race theory, identity politics, wokery, for want of a better word. The stuff that is very popular in Islington, where Corbyn lives, but not so popular, in Hartlepool.
Where I used to live. But also where Boris Johnson used to live, and I think Tony Blair lives around there.
Yeah, it's a great ground for some of our finest politicians. Emily Thornberry too.
What is critical race theory?
Oh God, I don't know really. I mean, it's got so many. Every time I was reading Andrew Doyle's book, which is actually very good. I'm trying to remember what it's called. The New Puritans. The New Puritans is as good a name for these people as any, actually. But he calls it critical social justice. It's all the same kind of thing, except every time you kind of start using one of these names, the people who espouse these ideas will suddenly reject them. So woke's a good example, where woke is not... Woke now it sounds like some pejorative that people will use against, people who describe themselves as being progressive, but it wasn't. I mean, until very recently, it was a word they absolutely used themselves. And then their critics latched onto this and started using it, and then they said, it's a pejorative, we never use that, it's a silly word. And so they'll switch to something else. I mean, critical social justice is probably as good as anything else. I mean, to put it as simply as I can, and it's deliberately not simple, it's deliberately convoluted, right? So, because when you really boil it down, the ideas are inherently quite absurd. But the whole thing is based around the idea that there is a kind of a pyramid of victimhood, that there is sort of a collective guilt amongst people who are in different groups, and the white male is the biggest offender, and anyone who's white really is, has got collective guilt. But if you're male, that's even worse. If you're female, you're a little bit better. If you're ethnic minority female, that's a bit better. If you're disabled, and so it goes on. And if you're gay, and then right at the top is like a black trans woman, whatever, right? So this is intersectionality thing going on in it. But the fundamental idea is that you need to aim not just for equality, but for equity, the difference being essentially the difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. And we must aim for equality of outcome, but for people as groups, as defined by sexuality, gender, and race, rather than equality as individuals. So it's very different from Marxism, which also basically aims for equality of outcome, really, or something very close to it. But Marxists, of course, are much more interested in class. There isn't much of a room for class in the critical social justice movement, and I think the reason for that is because the people in it are overwhelmingly quite posh, and so this is their way of portraying themselves as being part of a struggle, despite the fact they're actually pretty privileged. Does that make sense?
And so what does liberalism say to this?
Well, liberalism is really about the individual, so it's a complete antithesis of this. And I think that's, individualism as an ideology, as a concept, needs to make a revival, because if you don't have that, then you just end up with horrible discrimination, really, in which people are stereotyped and pigeonholed based on arbitrary physical characteristics. Like I say, I've never read any Ayn Rand, but one quote I quite like from Ayn Rand is that the smallest minority is the individual, and if you care about minority rights, then you should care most of all about the individual. So I think it's quite a clever way of putting it. You fight for the individual. If people want to get together as groups and fight, like trade unions, that's fine. The gay rights movement is one of the most successful kind of libertarian movements of the last 50 years. It's been a tremendous success. But fundamentally, it's liberated them as individuals, and people feel the benefit as individuals. Whereas critical justice theory, it's just inherently so divisive and basically racist, really, as well, and anti-individualist. And it just ensures that we as a society will be perpetually at war, perpetually treading on eggshells, trying to keep up with the latest jargon and worrying about something we might have tweeted 5 years ago because suddenly the ground has shifted below our feet and what used to be acceptable was no longer acceptable. And it's just the whole thing, I think, is probably doomed because there's so few people seem to me actually benefit from it. And it's kind of like, I was talking about the pyramid of victimhood, it's kind of like a pyramid scheme in itself, like a pyramid selling scheme, a Ponzi scheme, in that the number of people who benefit from it are really so small. It's kind of confined really to some academics doing some fairly worthless courses in some of our universities, and a handful of grifters who are selling courses on, how to speak properly, on what terminology to use, and various human resources kind of experts. But basically very few people really benefit from it, and a very large number of people, if they're not being actively disadvantaged by it, they certainly are not getting anything from it, and they can probably live in fear that they might be next. So the number of people at the moment who are actively disadvantaged by it is probably fairly small. It's probably, it's female swimmers, for example, right, being forced to compete against trans women. It's some women in prisons. It's funny, primarily it's women actually who are bearing the greatest brunt of it. But it's also, some people who are being overlooked for promotion due to, what they call positive discrimination. It's people who've been sacked from their jobs or been cancelled or otherwise demonised and persecuted because of things that they've said. And if it carries on, the number of victims will grow larger. And as I say, because so few people benefit from it, it seems to me fundamentally unsustainable. I hope so, anyway.
So the version of society that you imagine, like this freer society with a small government, how many people benefit from that?
Well, everybody should do, really. It's difficult to see who wouldn't. Well, I guess the people who wouldn't benefit would be the people who are getting rich out of the current system, who are benefiting from rent-seeking legislation or special privileges offered to them by the government. They wouldn't do so well.
Who's in that category?
Well, various bureaucrats, various businesses that have been given special. I'm not going to name names there necessarily, but there are quite a few people benefiting from crony capitalism. I think we saw that during the pandemic. And if we had genuinely free markets in a lot of areas, that we wouldn't get that.
What's an example of it without naming names?
Well, in the pandemic?
Yeah.
Well, it seemed, and we'll have to wait for the inquiry, but it seems as if there were quite a few people who got very lucrative contracts to provide quite dodgy personal protective equipment, who got those contracts despite never having any history in providing these things in the past, just because they happen to know a cabinet minister.
So that's just corruption, basically.
Yeah. Cronyism is basically corruption, but it's legal corruption a lot of the time. And I mean, we'll find out the extent to that. It's one of the more obvious examples, but governments that give monopoly power or effective monopoly power to various companies do very well out of it. There's bits of legislation which ensure that people have jobs enforcing various things or providing various things that are not they're not really necessary, but they do okay out of it. There's a huge number of people in human resources who wouldn't be there if we had a smaller state. Human resources didn't even used to be a thing. You used to have the personnel department, which sounds quite nice, and it was quite nice, and then suddenly became human resources, which is just almost caricaturistically cold name for talking about people. The people of the human resources. It makes it sound like coal or something. And human resource departments have essentially become an arm of the state, really, because there's so much legislation now in terms of employment law and other types of law, health and safety legislation, that a company of quite small companies have to have a human resources person now, just to make sure the government the company stays on the right side of the line legally. It used to be, not so long ago, that you could pretty much work out what the law was going to be if you were a reasonably decent person, because something that felt wrong would probably be illegal and something that was okay would be legal. And now you don't know. And so you have a lot of people being employed unnecessarily, being a drain on the company, who are effectively just acting as agents of the state within the company to tell people what stupid new legislation they have to put up with. Plus, these people will tend to form a little empire themselves and start gold plating it, and they really get quite enthusiastic about it. And now, people I think tend to fear having to speak to human resources because they wonder what terrible thing they've done. And I think a lot of the time, human resources people will create some kind of code of conduct that goes well above what the actual legislation says. And you may know from your own, career in the city that some of these big corporations are the worst offenders for bringing in a whole load of speech codes or whatever, so they can, I don't know what they're really trying to do. I guess show that they're great corporate citizens or something. But I've got people who, if I've got friends who work in the city, who tell me incredible stories about the kind of things that are going on at places like Goldman Sachs.
Okay, so what rule? So you think, legalize all drugs, no rules around, freely sell alcohol, tobacco, unhealthy food, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
what rules should there be?
Well, you shouldn't be able to sell alcohol and tobacco to children. You shouldn't be able to make false claims in your advertising. And that's about it, really.
And what should the role of the government be?
It doesn't really need one other than enforcing basic standards, preventing market failures, but market failures are actually pretty rare in these areas. The main one would be monopoly, which generally only happens when the government gets involved anyway, and certainly not going to happen in the alcohol market or the tobacco market. So I mean, the only real justification for the government constantly meddling in these areas is essentially paternalism, and I think paternalism is ethically unjustifiable. And in fact, mainstream economists wouldn't be able to justify paternalism. Economists can justify government regulation for sure in all sorts of different areas, and lots of economists are always looking for market failures to try and justify government regulation. And indeed, public health people will point to economic, kind of actually quite liberal economic arguments. They'll use examples like John Stuart Mill's harm principle. They'll talk about the market failure information asymmetries. They might not use these terms, but that's what they mean. Is they'll say, well, the industry is doing something here, which means actually the market has failed, or there are negative externalities associated with drinking or smoking or obesity. But actually, if you really dig into it, they nearly always don't exist. It's just an excuse for paternalism. And of course, public health people are primarily driven by paternalism. Otherwise, otherwise it wouldn't be public health people. These guys aren't, liberal economists who've just suddenly spotted a problem in this particular market. They're trying to stamp out smoking completely. They're trying to stamp out drinking completely, if some of them were honest. And one of the reasons I ended up getting into this area in such a big way is, and probably it's because I was a smoker at the time, but I started seeing the anti-smoking regulation come through, which I hadn't really noticed until the smoking ban came in. I hadn't really noticed. The warnings were getting bigger on the packs and the price was going up, and the advertising, of course, got banned, but it didn't bother me that much. It barely registered with me, to be honest. But then when they said you can't smoke in a pub, I was like, what? And I never met anybody who thinks you should be able to smoke in a pub. Where's this pressure coming from? And I looked into it, and it turned out it was just a government-funded pressure group called ASH. Here's another example of people who are going to lose out if I get my way and we start having a liberal economy. It's people who work for state-funded organisations. I mean, pressure groups, right? There's no justification for the government paying people to lobby them to do things. But yeah, it happens all the time, particularly in Scotland, actually, at the moment. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. So I saw what happened with smoking, and then when I saw the same people going after drinking and sugary drinks and so-called junk food and gambling, I thought, well, okay, we've got proof of concept now. We can see where this is going to go. And they're not really hiding the fact that they're going to use exactly the same tools to attack drinking as they did with smoking. And sometimes it's exactly the same people. So unless you want drinkers to be treated like smokers in a few years' time, which is to say basically second-class citizens, I think we need to draw a line under this at the very least. And so that was what got me. That was the slippery slope aspect, which had often been denied, seemed to me obviously true. And now in Scotland they're talking about a total ban on alcohol advertising. Well, it's only been less than 20 years since we had the total ban on tobacco advertising, but they're going from the same blueprint. So there's a blueprint for all this kind of stuff. It starts with putting taxes on things. We've had that with the sugar tax. It starts with banning the advertising, which is happening more and more, and there's more and more calls for various different things to have the advertising curtailed, including even like fossil fuels and cars, and there's always something that somebody wants to ban the advertising of because they'd really like to ban the product themselves, but they're one step at a time, right? So yeah, you see these sin taxes, you see the advertising bans, you see other regulations around licensing and just basically making it more difficult to buy the product or use a product. And you go, okay, well, logically, if we carry on like this, we're going to be in a situation where anything that is considered to be harmful to your health or even just immoral, like gambling, is going to be, on this conveyor belt towards prohibition. There's no doubt that cigarettes are going to be prohibited in my lifetime. No doubt whatsoever. I mean, some countries are... Right, exactly. So they're going for it in New Zealand. They talk about doing the same thing in America. They'll find various different words to use instead of prohibition, because prohibition still has a bad whiff about it. But they will do it, and they are doing it. And they said they wouldn't, right? Again, they said that with the slippery slope things, like, of course we don't want to ban cigarettes. We just want to ban the advertising of cigarettes or put the price up a bit or stop people smoking in bars. They always wanted to ban cigarettes. Of course they did. It's the only logical outcome of the crusade. And the same is exactly the same with sugary drinks and so-called junk food or chocolate bars or gambling of various forms. Gambling advertising's under the cosh at the moment. And ultimately alcohol. And just because it seems a long way off at the moment doesn't mean that it's not going to happen unless we do something to stop it happening.
And so how do you help people, though, who suffer with addictions, whether it be like they're an alcoholic or they're addicted to gambling or they're addicted to sugar and they're...
Well, you help them as individuals, you see, and it's not easy to do, but you can do it. So if you speak to somebody who's an alcoholic, the chances are they have some sort of story of trauma, all right, or they have various comorbidities, mental health problems, and so on, and that's why they're alcoholics. And to get these people and take them to a counsellor or whatever, and he then says, "Well, I can't see you because you're an alcoholic. Come back when you stop drinking." It's to completely miss the point. To try and ban advertising for alcohol or bring in minimum pricing or put the tax is to completely miss the point. Same with gambling. These things are essentially mental health issues of varying degrees of severity, and there's a reason for them. People do not become problem gamblers because of seeing a gambling advert on TV. They don't become alcoholics because they see alcohol advertising on TV or because alcohol is seen to be too cheap. Drugs, equally. There is no advertising, obviously, for drugs, and yet people become drug addicts. Why do they become drug addicts? Well, they're usually the same people who become alcoholics, who are also usually the same people who become problem gamblers. And they're a small minority of the population. So to present these things as being inherently addictive is not helpful, but it's also just obviously not true, right? The problem gambling rate in this country is 0.3%. Right? Most people gamble to some degree, even if it's only the lottery. And yet the problem gambling rate is a fraction of 1%. And those people are constantly moving in and out of being problem gamblers. And your average problem gambler is a lad in his 20s who will not be a problem gambler in 5 or 10 years' time. Alcoholics, right, not 80% of the population drink. Probably less than 5% are considered to be in any way dependent drinkers. Now, smoking's different. Most smokers are addicted to nicotine. I'll give you that one. But it's not true of alcohol. It's not true of gambling. And it's definitely not true of sugary drinks, as much as people might try and claim.
I think it's a genetic... It's 15% of the population is susceptible, where then alcohol can become as addictive as something like heroin. But for someone like me, that's not the case. I don't have that.
No, nor do most people. So to say that alcohol is an addictive substance is kind of meaningless. I mean, you can get to the state with, you can get to the situation in alcohol where you're so addicted that if you stop immediately you will die, right? Now that's clearly a physical addiction, right? If you're shaking and everything, but that you have to be drinking a hell of a lot of alcohol for a long time for that to be the case. There isn't a physical dependency that grabs you as soon as you have the first drink for the vast majority of people, or indeed for anybody.
So should the government help support those people, or should that be privately or like community, like Alcoholics Anonymous to support those people?
Well, I mean, I don't know how well Alcoholics Anonymous works. I wouldn't have a problem with having a tax on a product which does have that kind of negative externality in order to fund high quality rehabilitation. And we do that up to a point with gambling. We don't do it really that much with alcohol, although there are places you can go, run by the state, where you can speak to somebody about your drinking. that's a reasonable use of tax money, and it's reasonable to impose a tax on that product because at least it's to some extent hypothecated. To some extent you're saying, okay, there are negative externalities associated with this product, even though they're not necessarily caused by the product, and you could just take it out of general taxation. There's no particular reason why you wouldn't do. I mean, you take the rest of your healthcare spending out of general taxation, but considering that the number of people who are affected is actually relatively small and the number of people who buy the product is relatively large, you wouldn't need to have a very big tax on it in order to provide very high quality gambling rehabilitation, alcoholism rehabilitation. It could be done, and I don't think that would be illiberal.
And then what about for like heroin if you made that legal?
Well, same thing. Same thing. You have a tax on the product. I'm not sure I would have heroin per se legal, by the way. I mean, just because heroin is the dominant drug in the opiate market at the moment doesn't mean it would be under legalization. I mean, heroin was never really used until drugs were banned. It was certainly never used intravenously. There was no intravenous use of drugs at all, as far as I'm aware, until the war on drugs began. There's no latent demand for intravenous drug use. Heroin, like crack cocaine, is a product of prohibition, and so is intravenous use. And so if you actually legalized the drugs, by which I mean the core drug, so cocaine, opiates, THC.
People then will naturally do.
Well, I would like to think so. I mean, they certainly did before the war on drugs began. Now, maybe we can't put that genie back in the bottle, but I would like to think that if we legalized drugs, what would happen is people would smoke opium rather than inject heroin, which is what they did before the drug war began, and that would be a lot better for them, and the chances of you overdosing would be far, far lower, and you couldn't be killed by the product being too pure, which is what happens a lot of the time with heroin. MDMA I would leave basically as it is. LSD and magic mushrooms I would leave basically as they are. Cannabis.
Well, they're the ones that will be legalized sooner because of, at least for medicinal reasons.
Yeah, well, I hope so, yeah.
MDMA.
Yeah.
And psychedelics.
Yeah,
so
I
what
hope
do you
so.
mean you'll leave as is?
Well, I wouldn't try. What I'm saying is I don't think I would, bearing in mind that legalization does require regulation, right? There's regulation of alcohol at the moment. We don't say it's a complete free-for-all. And you can't walk into a shop and buy 100% proof alcohol and neck it, right? And not that anybody particularly wants to do so. But I'm not sure I would necessarily make it legal to sell a gram of heroin. What I think I would do would make it legal to sell an ounce of opium, right, which you could smoke. I don't think I would legalize selling a gram of crack cocaine, but I would probably legalize some kind of product that had cocaine in it. So again, before the war on drugs, cocaine wasn't actually used all that much, but it was in Coca-Cola, right? It was in Coca-Cola until about 1903 in obviously quite small doses. And I'm not sure that was a massive problem, funnily enough. But, things have changed. There used to be patent medicines. Laudanum was a way in which a lot of people would take opium. So laudanum was kind of this, what would you call it, a tincture, I guess. And you would have a drop or two on the tongue. Gladstone used to take it before doing speeches, and it was alcohol plus some herbs plus opium. But nobody was shooting up heroin because it's too much. Why would you want to? The only reason they do it now is because you got to get the absolute most of the drug for your money because it's so expensive because of prohibition. So I would like to turn the clock back. I'm not sure to what extent you can do that. Obviously, that genie is out of the bottle. And if you legalise cocaine, then it wouldn't take a huge amount of effort for somebody to stick it in a pan with some bicarbonate of soda and turn it into crack cocaine. Well, there's nothing I can really do about that. But it has to be said, this is all just wishful thinking because it's never going to happen. We might see the legalisation of mushrooms, perhaps, MDMA, possibly, LSD, possibly. We haven't even seen the legalisation of cannabis yet, and there's not really much of a movement in the UK to legalise it. It'll probably happen eventually, but I'd be impressed if that happens, let alone legalising psychedelics, and certainly I don't ever see a time when opiates and cocaine are legalized. And to be fair, who's actually going to sell them? I mean, you're leaving yourself wide open to class action lawsuits left, right, and centre anyway, because people will, die, now and again as a result of taking cocaine, or have heart attacks and what have you. People will find ways of overdosing, and then the company's going to be liable. So in 2022, what blue chip company is going to be getting into the market for opiates and cocaine? The fentanyl people are already in enough trouble in America, rightly so by the sounds of it.
I guess if you had it where it was like, how it is in Peru, where it's the coca leaves,
right? Yeah,
and then you're putting it in tea, and
it's traditional. You go back to the traditional way of taking these drugs. That's the ideal. I don't think there'd be a problem if you had opium bars open up. You'd have to get rid of the smoking ban, but that would be a bonus as far as I'm concerned. I'm also not sure how much latent demand there actually is for taking a lot of drugs. I mean, people might smoke a bit of opium now and again if you legalized it. I don't think a huge number of people would be, on it all the time. They never used to be. This is the thing. All this stuff was completely legal for centuries. Everybody in Victorian England would have taken opium at some point, usually as pain relief. But you could get it anywhere. Up until the 1968 Pharmacy Act, you could buy it in any shop, in any pub. It would be there. But there was never any kind of real panic about opium being kind of abused as a recreational drug. So why are we assuming everyone's going to suddenly get off their head on drugs if we legalise them? I think if you treat people like adults, by and large, they actually behave like adults.
And if there's the education around.
Yeah. And also it probably wouldn't be cool anymore.
So the form that's in wouldn't lead to what's going on with the, 100,000 people dying of these opioid.
With fentanyl.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but then you got people like Tom Petty and Prince who are accidentally overdosing on these things because they don't know. It's really powerful stuff, and it's easy to take, and it's easy to forget how much you've taken, I think. But these are medicines, I'm not envisaging drugs being sold like that. I'm envisaging people taking these drugs recreationally in a relatively traditional form.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Is there anything else you want to say before we wrap up and I ask you one more question?
Yeah, ask me one more question.
What book has had the most impact on you?
I'd be probably On Liberty by John Stuart Mill, really, in terms of what we're talking about. It's just a book I think everybody should read. It's really... Have you read it?
It's on the bookshelf.
It's on the bookshelf. It's a small one as well, so it's not like some of these really chunky books. It's very well written. And the arguments are so powerful, no one's ever really managed to rebut them. People have had a go here or there, but most of it's nitpicking. He just gives the perfect explanation of why individualism is important, why free speech is critically important, why paternalism is damaging, and also why there needs to be kind of constitutional limits on democracy, really, in order to prevent mob rule, which I think is an important point. And it's something that they've got in America, albeit, in a way that is sometimes controversial. And of course, the Constitution has always been reread in different ways. But I think the basic idea that governments should stay in their lane is a very important one. Because I do believe, really, that in Britain at least, the John Stuart Mill way of looking at the world is almost a given. I think the basic idea that you can do what you want so long as it doesn't impinge on other people and so long as you leave other people alone, I think is something that most people in their hearts agree with, and has been the unspoken message behind English civilization, certainly for a very long time. But it's always been perverted and corrupted in some ways, because also people are quite susceptible to demagogues. People get whipped up by, what Mencken called the endless series of hobgoblins. In other words, moral panics, and people are prepared to, throw away other people's liberties quite easily when they get whipped up into those states. And I guess part of what I see my role as being is to look at the facts and say, actually, there isn't, this isn't a crisis. This isn't an epidemic. This is something that we can, probably live with if we're going to live with each other, and there has to be a certain amount of toleration in society. Otherwise everybody ends up suffering eventually. That's the thing, because it goes back to the slippery slope thing before. You can throw the smokers under the bus because you don't like the smell of tobacco, fine, right? But they will come for you if you drink, if you gamble, if you like eating tasty food. Eventually the Puritans will come for everybody, and then they'll come for each other. And there's no one left at the end of this, because things just keep getting more and more extreme. And On Liberty makes the very important point that you're going to end up with this kind of chaotic and ultimately very damaging mob rule unless you just accept as a society. It doesn't even have to be part of a written constitution, but you just accept as part of the social contract that you can basically do whatever you want, even if most people might consider it to be foolish or misguided. And those people can tell you that you're being foolish and misguided. But so long as you are of basically sound mind, you should be allowed to make mistakes, because sometimes they might actually not turn out to be mistakes. Sometimes it might be the rest of society that's wrong and you're the one who's right. And his famous line about free speech is that even if one person was wrong and the rest of the society was right, they shouldn't have the right to overturn that person, because now and again it's the other way around. Now and again it's the minority are correct and the majority are wrong. In fact, quite often the minority are correct, and that's how we've seen. I mentioned the gay rights movement before, right? That's completely turned its head in the last 50 years, from being a very, obviously a minority pursuit, but just like the desire to legalize homosexuality, apart from anything else, was a kind of a quirky thing. On the other hand, you then had the paedophile information exchange in the 1970s. They were a bunch of eccentrics, but and they were wrong in my opinion and the vast majority of people's opinion. But they still had the right, I think, to say what they wanted to say. And so, in order to have...
What did they want to say?
Well, they were basically in favour of paedophilia. It was a weird extension of the 60s sexual liberation movement. But Harriet Harman was involved in it at one point, and this came out later on that Harriet Harman had been involved with the paedophile information exchange, and it was considered very shocking. But actually, she was wrong, but you should have the right to say that. You shouldn't have the right to do it, but you should have the right to say it.
Well, I guess it's better that people say these things so then you can provide the education rather than this stuff going on underground. Well,
yeah, definitely, because 100 years ago, the people calling for gay rights were seen very much as being the equivalent of the paedophile information exchange. Society changes, so it's very important to have free speech. This is the point that the Mill makes, and hopefully it's blindingly important to people today that free speech is under severe threat, even when it's not legal. Mill talked a lot about the kind of the tyranny of majority and the tyranny of opinion, and that even like the social pressure on people not to speak out could become stifling. And that's basically what cancel culture is today. So free speech, and the basic idea that your right to swing your fist does end at my nose, but that's as far as it goes. You want to go around swinging your fist anywhere else, that's fine, as long as I'm not near it. And that is, in short, the makings of a decent and tolerant and free society. And paternalism, which is a thing I rage against, is a major threat from that point of view, because the whole point of paternalism is it assumes that one group of people knows better than another group of people. And coercive paternalism is much worse, because then they use government action in order to force people to do what is considered to be right for them. And maybe in some cosmic way, maybe in some objective way, possibly they're correct, and what people are doing is bad for them, and maybe they will regret it. But there's no way of knowing that, a priori. So let's not go down that road, because if they're wrong, they are severely damaging the welfare of very large numbers of people.
Or that can stay within religions, I guess.
Well, it always used to be about religion. Mill was mainly writing about religious groups in On Liberty. They were seen as the big threat to freedom, as these kind of fanatical, the temperance movement he writes about quite a bit. He actually even writes about the anti-opium people at one point. He didn't like them either. But yeah, in Mill's day, it was mainly religious groups who were clamping down on people's freedom. The Sabbatarians, who already talked about the Sunday trading law, he hated all that kind of stuff. But it wasn't, in those days, it wasn't Tesco's, having to wait until 10 o'clock to open. It was like you couldn't do anything on a Sunday. There was no theatre, there was nothing, and that was religious. And we got rid of that, and again, it goes back to this kind of optimism I had in, the 80s and 90s as I was growing up, just thinking, well, the path of history is basically all moving in a liberal direction. And then it stopped moving in direction, and it feels in the last 10 years in particular, it's been doing quite an abrupt U-turn, and it's very worrying to me.
I guess it's funny though, because it's like talking religion and like World Cup in Qatar, and people are the same people who are like so against that are, the idea of you can't have homosexuality and blah 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 because of this religion, and it's all involved in the whole throughout society. But then those people are likely also pro shutting down things they don't agree with here. So then, but it's like the misunderstanding, that's why we don't cancel free speech or don't have government controlling anything, because the government can just change and start banning the things that are really important to you.
The government is a slow lumbering beast and a bully, an oaf, really. The government will, once society has changed, the government will come along years too late and then say, okay, we're changing this now. But they'll overcorrect, and so things that were banned suddenly become compulsory and vice versa. They just overdo it. We don't need the government around. There's nothing great about... Some people will say in arguments against libertarians that, there's lots of great things the governments have done over the years. And somebody said this to me at the Battle of Ideas a few years ago. Because I was saying there's too much regulation, too many laws. And this guy was saying, yeah, but what about all the great things the government done? And it was like, well, like what? He says, well, they abolished slavery. Well, yeah, okay, but that was over 200 years ago. If you're having to go back 200 years to find like a law that everyone can agree was a good thing, the abolition of slavery, fine, right? But who legalized slavery in the first place? Who banned homosexuality in the first place? It was the government, right? So yeah, I'm fine. I'll happily applaud the government when it undoes the bad stuff it's done, but they did it in the first place. To say that this is an advert for big government is absurd. Big government was a problem in the first place, and finally it comes along once society is basically moved in that direction anyway a lot of the time, and it undoes the damage it's done. It wants what do you want? A pat on the back for it,
And so people can read about paternalism and all of your work in your book Killjoys.
Yeah, that's the one that's all about paternalism. Yeah, and that is available online at the IEA website, or just Google it really. Snowdon Killjoys should come up as a PDF. You can buy it if you want on Amazon as a paperback. But yeah, that's my final word on paternalism. I've written other stuff too, which you can check out, but that's the one about that.
Are you writing anything at the moment?
Sort of, but it's a secret. It won't be out for a long time. In fact, I've got 2 big projects, both of which should be out in about 2024.
Nice. Okay. anything else you want to promote before we wrap up?
Yeah, I do a podcast with Spiked every 2 weeks called Last Orders. It's about Nanny State. Well, it used to be. Now it's just a general chat about the news, but it was about Nanny State. And I do a fortnightly YouTube show called The Swift Half with Snowdon, which I get an interesting guest to talk about things for half an hour.
And people can find you on
And I'm on Twitter at CJ Snowdon.
Nice. Well, thanks a lot.
Good talking to you.
You too.